that's important if they want to keep it variability. Although, for many people, they don't have it for
Because I remember as a high school student, I was able to go in and add my birthday to the list of famous birthdays on my day.
Yeah.
And then I would see how long it would stay up.
You're more brilliant than I am. I tried to get my own page up, and I ended up with like
It's difficult now.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
like
no,
behind
anyone?
where anyone can see. I can go in and edit it, but it's not available. So that
What if all of us got together and made a Wikipedia page for you?
Yeah.
Ooh.
if you know how, that would be fun.
Could we like get sponsors to, or, like signatures to say this is real?
I guess.
We could probably do that.
I don't know how that's done. I know if you go read my professor
Yeah.
and you look me up, I've been in there for.
I love that website.
Me too.
It's really helpful.
Oh, that's, he's got 5.0.
Yeah.
Jeez, I
Mine?
don't like him that much.
Who's
Oh, the
Ron.
geography professor. No, he seems like a good person. I just
my?
get a little bored in his class.
No, I'm not. I don't want to do
I
that.
think you have to search for a professor or school. Hey, look at that.
I get readings every once in a while.
Hey, 53 student ratings. Not bad.
So that's cool. So if you have that, why can't you have a Wikipedia? I don't.
Brent has a Wikipedia page. Yeah.
How?
What?
Yeah.
Plus, I've had a website for all this time.
Yeah, see, you have all kinds of credible sources to link your page to.
Sure.
So, it seems to me like there's lots of things about Leibniz that we didn't discuss, of course. I don't know how far we got with the monadology, but something I'd love to point out is that he was on the right side of the relativity, or the Euclidean steady state universe idea. So he was on the right side of that, even though most people during his time were not. And his concept of the monadology is very confusing, and most people didn't understand that. But today, modern physicists look at it as a precursor to like the whole idea of quarks and basically the standard model that we use today. He, of course, doesn't deal with the entire standard model, but the idea that a monad is essentially a spirit, and that's the confusing thing, because his vocabulary, he's talking about these are spirits, but if you think, okay, reframe it and say that when they were saying spirit, we say energy today, then he was basically on track, because we don't today think of the basic particles as actually being matter. They become matter at a certain level of complexity. But when you get down lower, they're just energy in an arrangement, and energy is not something that's moving, it's energy itself in an arrangement, which is baffling because, of course, we're used to thinking in terms of a macro level of perception where things are things and not energy. Energy is something that things have, right? So very confusing. Plus, he refers to God as a monad. It's like, what? What on earth does that mean? Plus, when he talks about things like the total harmony of everything, that seems odd as well. Let me get to I think I better notice someplace else. This is me. too many notes, right? Does any of this help anywhere? By the way, who was it that invented pants? Jefferson or Franklin?
Pants.
I think it was Franklin, but it might have been Jefferson.
Well, they were. What do you mean pants?
Okay, so they had like knee breeches, but I believe it was Jefferson that invented long pants. Like,
No, I'm curious.
pardon?
Now I'm curious.
Yeah. See if it's something that's.
Just doesn't seem like it should have taken humanity that long to figure out long pants.
That was my notes on. I just zipped right by it. Okay, so yeah, so some of these are just really weird. So the harmony that every present state of a simple substance is a natural consequence of its preceding state, in such a way that its present is always the cause of its future. So it's a deterministic theory. Everything is as it is because it was caused by what went before and what will follow, etc. Or in some sense, if all time exists at once, it actually kind of totally screws up the evolution narrative, because dinosaurs are still present in a point in time and space. They haven't gone away. And all of our ancestors, so it's not like I could have come from them, because in a sense, even when they were, I always would have been, right? So that doesn't fit well with, the idea that we evolved from them if we were concurrently existing at some other time and space. That, right? You see how that's not coherent. But remember, the trick with accepting models seems to be keeping them compartmented. Okay, so this model's good for this stuff. Don't make such a big thing out of this model, and then you feel like you can't believe this model, which is useful for other things. They're different tools, so somehow enable your mind so that you can think that there's lots of different possible ways of conceiving the universe, and it's not the case that the universe is one of those ways at the expense of your not being able to use the others. And that doesn't just apply to things like the universe, that applies to things like what's a human being, what are races, I'm thinking of Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm reading his newest book. We were 8 years in power or something. He's talking about Obama and others. If you're not familiar with him, he's a writer from Baltimore. He grew up in the neighborhood where they had the riots and stuff, but he now writes for The Atlantic. He's a successful writer, but he thinks of himself as black, as coming from a black neighborhood, as being raised as a member of a black gang, and thinking, et cetera. So when you're thinking in terms of models, he's trying to describe in his book various models. He doesn't call them that. He's in his mind, he has a bit of an education. He went to I think it was Morehouse College for a couple of years, but dropped out, became a writer. So he's not current with regard to like contemporary sociological, anthropological stuff. Right? He's writing from his perspective as a person that lived through a certain set of experiences, right? And he's trying to cope with them, because he's wealthy enough now that he's living in a middle-class neighborhood where all his neighbors are white, right? And so he's confused about how he got there, how to help the people in the neighborhood. So he's got these different models in his head that he's playing with without thinking of them as models. He's thinking of this is the real way to understand this. And that's a weakness, because of course if he's trying to figure out which of the models are best, really what you might want to do is figure out what model does what does it help. If you think of, say, being black as automatically meaning you're prejudiced by all the status quo and you're not going to be able to get ahead because of their oppression, then that's going to limit the kinds of activities you feel like you could do, et cetera, to help yourself, et cetera, right? If, on the other hand, you think in terms of like the pound cake model that he uses, which he gets from not the football player who's called Pound Cake, that I think he was the one that died, right, in the car crash, but instead that's a Bill Cosby lecture that he had been doing all around, where he basically berates the race for dying for a pound cake. A young man basically robbed a store of a pound cake and got shot, and in the head and died. So he got killed for a pound cake. Why do we? Why is stealing a pound cake so important to us that we do that kind of thing, right? So it's the black races at fault for misbehaving. Instead, they should be acting more decently, and then So where do you put the model? Who's that going to help, right? Is it their fault, or is it the oppressive? Both models are false in a lot of ways. You really need to go and talk to individuals to find out why they think it's so important to steal a pound cake from the store. But the thing is, if you're reading his work and you're trying to think, he ought to be trying to figure out what these two models accomplish. Do they accomplish something? Maybe you should refine those models in different ways. Sorry if I'm confusing this, but what I'm trying to suggest is that this way of model thinking, did I ever show you the Stephen Hawking reference to this? So they actually have a book, The Grand Design, that he co-wrote with Mladenov. I've mentioned this, yes, maybe not. But so, model-dependent realism, it's realizing that we, besides constructing our language, we also construct these models within which the language works that enable us to accomplish things. But don't confuse the models with the universe itself. In fact, the idea that there's a reality out there besides the models is actually a part of a model. Right? It could be, screw your head up. But you get the idea. So it's meaningless to think of a true reality. Of course, those that do are working with a model that assumes there is such a true reality, and we're trying to grasp it. Right? But what you're doing is always constructing a conceptual schema of how the universe works in whatever thing you're doing. How do you make a dress? How do you make a boyfriend? Sorry, I don't know where I'm going with any of this stuff. Why do you need a boyfriend? Why do you need a girlfriend? The opera that is coming up this weekend, I think it's tomorrow night, it's called As One, right? Have you heard of it? As One. So it's an opera with two people singing, I think just 4 instruments, plus a movie, and it's based on a person who's transitioned from being male to a female. As one. Yes? No? Never heard of it?
Think again. Anchorage Opera invites you to experience the elaborate Oscar premiere of As One, February 9th, 10th, and 11th at the PAC. A story told with empathy and humor about identity and authenticity as two voices share the part of one protagonist in transition. This multimedia experience with music by Laura Kaminsky features a film by famed cinema documentarist Kimberly Reed, on whose life the show is based. Just 75 minutes in length, no one will fall asleep at this opera. The script by Mark Campbell and Kimberly Reed is sung in English. A prologue of #transformative stories presented by members of our own community starts the evening off, and talkback discussions with the cast and crew follow each show. Can this be opera? Indeed it can. For tickets, call 263-ARTS or visit AnchorageOpera.org. As One, February 9th, 10th, and 11th. Anchorage Opera. Try it. You might love it.
So it's an opera. Clearly, they're constructing a model that they're using there that would be at odds with the models a lot of other people use with regard to identity. The idea that you can be in transition from one type of person to another, basically going from male to female. A lot of people don't believe that that really happens. But that's because they have a different model. And they're thinking in terms of this model's true and that model's false, right? But if you accept that we can have multiple models and you wonder, what do these models accomplish for the people that use them, right? Is it helpful? No, maybe, you know. So in that sense, you're operating at kind of a meta level so that you're not in the box, right? You get that metaphor, right? You know, if you're in the box, you can only see how that box lets you see. But if you're looking at all of these as various types of boxes, you can actually create your own boxes. Say, aha, how about we think this way? And then you create a new box, so which might have even more usefulness. So you know, that's where geniosity comes in, right? People are amazed. How did you think of that? It's because you're not in the box where they are. It's just, by the way, this is a box. Model-dependent realism box. But that's a cool box. And it's apparently got lots of useful things. But so let's go back and think. This particular theory, the optimism theory, that got him into a lot of trouble. You might be familiar with Voltaire. Yes? What was Voltaire's first name? How many names did he have? Voltaire? François-Marie Arouet? I don't know how to say that. Voltaire.
Oh.
He looks like a male in transition, actually. No, I don't know. However, he saw the optimism. So what was the optimist claim that Leibniz gave us? This is the best of all possible worlds, because God is all powerful, you know, also known as omnipotent, right? Omnibeneficent, etc. In other words, God wouldn't possibly make a screwed up world. God could only make a perfect world. You think, wait a minute, you know, chickens are not happy, you know, in Delaware, you know, because, you know, they cut their beaks off so that they can't nastify one another, because that screws up the meat, etc. Right? So every so often they, you know, they hot. It sounds awful, doesn't it? You didn't know that? No? Yeah. The most hilarious thing I've ever seen, though, is where they raise boneless chickens.
Oh, Jesus.
Boneless,
Is that real?
boneless chicken farms. You've never seen a picture of boneless chicken farms?
No, I haven't.
real.
No.
Oh.
I know, I thought you were 100% serious.
So sorry.
That's pretty good, isn't it? I can do that. I can fool people.
So if they don't have
Oh,
beaks,
okay.
how do they like?
They don't really raise boneless chickens.
No, I'm talking about before the beaks that are cut off.
Oh, that's true.
Why wouldn't, I mean,
As far as
couldn't they just like
I've heard.
try to genetically like manipulate it to where they like just
Have
don't
no
have
beaks.
them? Like, I don't know, like, wouldn't that be like a
I
little
feel like
bit,
that would be more humane for the poor bird.
that would be more humane or less humane?
More humane to just not have beaks than to chop them off.
Yeah.
But this isn't the kind of stuff that Voltaire, well,
Or just don't do it.
It's probably more expensive to,
could be.
Yeah.
But of course they've made them so robust in the front that they can't even stand up.
They're also not like they've been genetically mutated like the way that eggs are now. They're not supposed to be like that. It like a lot of them apparently have like a lot of issues because like they're not made to produce eggs like that, but they were like genetically mutated to do so. So like most of them it like hurts them a lot to like lay eggs and stuff, which sucks. But
Well, Voltaire didn't complain about this stuff because they didn't have it back then. But the things he did complain about were like earthquakes, the big waves that come.
Tsunami.
Well, he didn't call them that. What did he call? Well, he was French. But the big waves, the tidal waves, whatever.
Okay.
It is odd that things have different names in English depending on where they are. Tsunami if it's in the Pacific, but we don't talk about tsunamis in the Atlantic. We talk about tidal waves. Tsunamis is an Asian word, so that we picked it up when we're over there, but when we come back, that's weird. But so Voltaire feels like it's just ridiculous to think that this is the best of all possible worlds. Thing was, I don't think that's what Leibniz meant. When you think instead of what he meant, it seems like what physicists today, when I think of Brian Greene, Elegant Universe, Ted, I guess, only fine-tuned for life. Okay, so
here's the surprise. They found that the expansion is not slowing down. Instead, they found that it's speeding up, going faster and faster. Just what we need to explain the observations, because the repulsive gravity, but so far no one has found a way to do that. Now, that would be able to describe all the forces at work, eternal inconsistencies, unless we allow for something wholly unfamiliar. Extra dimensions of space. That is, we all know about the usual 3 dimensions of space, and you can think about those. Out for the cosmic speed up. Look at what they found. This number is small.
So, I mean, you can watch the whole thing. It's only like 16 minutes, but it's talking about the contemporary picture of the universe and the multiverse, and explanations for how our universe works. And this odd number here turns out to be I forget exactly how he describes it, but it's a particular force in the universe that's just exactly that. And thanks to that, that enables the kind of expansion that we've had in the universe to create suns, planets, atmospheres, oxygen, etc. Any other number, and this universe would not have been able to do any of that, right? So when we were looking at the theory today that says there's a multiverse, all these different possible universes, I guess, are real, that are out there, only this one has enabled life. You see how that works? All the others would not have theoretically enabled stars to form planets, etc. So In other words, this is the best of all possible universes if you want life. That's what I think Leibniz had in mind. Obviously not with all the sophisticated modeling that's not something he could have even imagined, I don't think. But the idea that of all the possible worlds that God could have created, one where people get sick and die, that's an absolute necessity for the maintenance. I mean, you know, you couldn't make the universe better where, you know, if everybody lived forever, you know, it would not have sustained life for long because we would have overpopulated. Actually, we're doing that. That gets in a whole lot of other issues. But so he's not suggesting that everybody's going to have a happy life. It means that you're, you know, hopefully do okay, right? But not everybody can. You know, it's competitive, all that stuff. That's part of the best of all possible universes.
This is like totally unrelated, but it just like came in my head as a question. So like a lot of people, like when talking about like the human like psyche, they talk about how it like there's no like limit to what you can know. You can learn and learn and learn, and it like seems as though time is like the only limit that like inhibits us from not being able to grow.
Or
So
blood pressure.
yeah, that too. So do you think that like if, you know, like theoretically speaking, if there was someone that could live forever, do you think like their brain would ever like pop? Like how much can they learn, you know, before it's just ridiculous?
Yeah, I'm hoping to find out, actually. So far, so good.
I mean, you never know if
But-
you're immortal or not until you're dead. You never know.
And you go, oh,
Oh man, yeah.
shoot.
I mean, you could learn, if you lived forever and you could learn, you know, theoretically learn and learn and learn, but you do forget things. So
That's
in
true,
the end,
that's true.
it's kind of like, you know, you're not, if you're 1,000 years old, it's gonna be really hard to remember what it was like when you're 10 or 100 at that age.
Right, right.
So it's kind of like the mind flushes out what you don't need anymore. And
That's
I disagree, though. I think it's hard to recall stuff,
okay.
but I think it's actually in your head, and if the right trigger's there, I remember.
Okay.
If I have ruby slippers on and I'm clicking my heels together, what am I thinking?
Wizard of Oz.
There's no place like home. Wizard of Oz. Did you see the movie The Lion King?
Yeah.
I have seen it.
How did Mufasa die?
You asked us this already.
I
and
did.
we
I
didn't
did this to
remember.
you already.
We didn't even remember those. It
He
was like failed.
stampeded.
Yeah.
That's right.
Now
you
we
guys failed me. Oh.
Sorry.
Well, but that's my thesis. Okay. So this is, you know, Voltaire understood it differently, thinking that, you know, what he was saying was that everybody's life should be peachy keen. And he wrote a play called Candide. You ever studied it? Candide? It's a comedy where these nobles basically go from one disaster to another, experiencing, you know, the flood, the, you know, volcanic eruption, earthquake, and all that stuff. And each time they die, but then the next part of the play, they show up again, and it turns out that they lucked out and they didn't die, you know. And they keep saying this is, Candide keeps saying this is the best of all possible worlds, etc. But they keep having disaster. The fun thing is that we have a show this fall. Is this fall? No, spring. This spring coming. Called Candide, right? Which is the American version of it, and that's by Bernstein. And let's pick. I'll play my favorite. Kristen Chenoweth. And be gay. What's something and be gay.
As for the poor beauty, she lives for Mondays. When she rests,
Kristen Chenoweth. You familiar with her? I think she's terrific.
He's a really good singer.
My song. You go. Go.
She's supposed to be American.
Forced to bend my soul to a sordid role, victimized by bitter circumstance. Alas for me, had I remained beside my lady mother, my virtue had remained unstained until my maiden hand was gained by some grand duke or other. 'Twas not to be, harsh necessity brought me to this gilded cage. Born to higher things, here I drew.
It is funny. Are you bored?
I'm not entirely sure what the context of it is.
Singing of a sorrow.
See all this jewelry all over the couch? She's going to start putting it on.
And yet outside I like to revel. I have no strong objection to champagne. My lord of basic space
In other words, she sold herself into a life where she receives all these wonderful.
being basely tearful. Show me no boasters.
She's really just an expensive.
Bright and cheerful.
So she's having those qualms over her lost virtue. But she likes the jewelry too, so. My favorite though.
My darling, why you sleep? All is well, we are friends, and that's swell. But the truth is that I have a secret to tell. I love you.
This is Kristen Chenoweth.
People say it's wrong, it's absurd that a frog and a bird are in love, but I know in my heart this was so meant to be. If only we could hug and get close, be heavenly bliss, that your lungs would explode and you look just like this, and you'd gag with your face turning blue. Ew. But darling, I'll protect you, I will, don't worry, just chill, cause there isn't a bird that I wouldn't kill for you. Can't you see? Oh, we were destined to be for real.
What movie is that?
Rio 2.
Two of those? Yeah.
I just love it. I think it's fantastic. But that's not what we're here for. So I'm sorry. Back to business. So Candide is playing this spring. The opera and the symphony are doing it together. Next month, I think. I forget. Maybe it's April. But so this year. So watch for it in the ads and stuff at the PAC. But it's Leonard Bernstein's American musical take on Voltaire's play that makes fun of Leibniz. In Candide, one of the characters is Dr. Pangloss, which means all-knowing. And he's an annoying know-it-all, of the worst kind. So they're making fun of. It's pretty clear that it's Leibniz that they're making fun of. However, let me move on to a contemporary of Leibniz, who is from, he is Irish, but he's not Irish genetically. I mean, his parents are from England. They've moved to Ireland, and he's born in Ireland, so he thinks of himself as Irish. He does, in fact, live most of his life in Ireland. He becomes a bishop, and he's very concerned about his people. Part of the Irish problems occur during this time, so he's very, very involved in trying to help them medically and use his science in order to try to help them and so on. But just like the others, he's also into optics. One of the neat things about his study in optics is he's the one, apparently, I don't know if you ever find anyone else prior to him, he seems to be the first one to figure out why we have the advantage of two eyes that give us then a sense of depth perception. By having two eyes, we can tell how far something is away. So that's pretty cool. Remember, Sir Isaac Newton is also figuring out how colors break out through crystals when you're shining the sun through them, and realizes you can't put them back together, actually. So it's kind of, so they're really, remember Galileo's grinding lenses and making telescopes and microscopes or whatever. Leibniz is into microscopes, and I don't know that he used them. I bet he used them on telescopes too. And of course Spinoza's killing himself grinding lenses. But so they're all interested in all this kind of stuff, and how it works. Trying to figure out a theory of vision. How does this work? By the way, a friend of his is the author of Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift. So they're good friends, and in fact, it was through the auspices of Jonathan Swift that Berkeley got published, because it was his sponsor, Swift's sponsor, that got him published as well. He came up with the idea of starting a college in the New World, and so he literally went to the king, says, "We need a college, I'd like to start it, would you fund it?" The king said, "Yes, I will." Great idea. And so Berkeley figured, well, first thing, now, you want to start a college in the New World, what's the first thing you would think of? He thinks, I need a wife. And so he, I don't know how the courtship went. He probably said, do you want to go with me to Bermuda? Because that's where he said he would build a college, in Bermuda. In any case, so he got married and set sail with a library to found this college. Instead of going to Bermuda, though, they first went to New England, where the colony already was started.
Does he have to go all the way back? Started the way across the Atlantic.
Yes. And he actually never made it to Bermuda. He went to what becomes Rhode Island, Providence, and started a farm. And the idea was the farm would need to feed the college because there wouldn't be an ability to raise the crops in Bermuda to feed the college. So he's going to start the farm in New England. Well, meanwhile, he also lectures at the churches there, and that's pretty darn interesting, and lots of people really enjoy his lectures. But what's really also interesting here, and I'll tie this into someone that you usually don't get to study, and that's Jonathan Edwards. So there's an interesting controversy over this. Some people that think while Berkeley George was in the New World, that he influenced Jonathan Edwards, but other people actually argue the opposite, that Jonathan Edwards' ideas influenced Berkeley. That doesn't seem to make sense to me at all, because Jonathan Edwards was basically a rural kid with no possibility of an education. Berkeley is coming to the New World with an education already, and writes letters to Leibniz. So, as you'll see, I think he and Leibniz are like this in a lot of their ideas. And what's interesting is that Jonathan Edwards has some of those ideas too, and so where did they come from? To me, it looks like, oh, this is a European thing, but there are people that write books that argue the other way. So that's kind of interesting. We could also argue that Jonathan Edwards is the first homegrown American philosopher. That's probably true. I mean, depending on what you mean by philosophers, right? But notice he's before the founding fathers folks, before Franklin, before Jefferson, before all of those folks. This is earlier. And he's a fire and brimstone preacher. So that's pretty cool. When you look at, he was such a fiery and brimstony kind of preacher that the one church fired him because he was too scared. But he did, of course, have lots of people that he converted, and there's some absolutely fantastic letters. I'm not sure. I should always check how I can find these letters for you. I don't think this is really the one I wanted. I've found this one before. But so he's converted lots of people to, the being saved. So I think they would refer to his effect on people as the first great burning over or whatever. There's an area in New York that's referred to as the burned over district. That's not because of him, that's because of others. So it's been burned over multiple times, right? So this is where they have all these religious revivals, if you're familiar with that. William Miller was one of the ones that was the preacher that influenced Joseph Smith.
Wait, who?
Joseph Smith?
No, the other guy before.
William Miller? So the American, homegrown American religions are referred to as Millerite religions. And the four of them include Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, the Shakers, and the Latter-day Saints.
Who are the Shakers?
The Shakers are gone. They disappeared.
Themselves up essentially because they didn't believe in having children.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
That was sad.
The furniture is still around, though.
That was so sad to
Actually,
read about.
I think there's two
That
Shakers
now.
still living.
Really?
Yeah,
Is that
They
salt
used to have
and pepper?
four.
No, that's
but now they have two left.
Wait,
Because they don't have children.
why don't they just? But then can't people become Shakers? So there could be like new
They
ones?
thrived before adoption. You had to legal adoption was put into place.
Oh,
So you
yeah.
would just drop kids off with the Shakers.
Oh.
Oh. Because they didn't want them anymore, and the Shakers would take them and raise them well. And
Okay, that
leave what
makes
they wanted.
sense.
But then now that you have to go through a legal process, people will just dump kids with the Shakers. So then
Oh.
they slowly died off.
yeah. There's I've never really. I have the book at home. I have quite a few books on him actually. Part of that is because my professor in my alma mater, Dr. George Claghorn, specialized in Jonathan Edwards. So, and when he retired, he gave me his book, which is like volume 23 of the collected works of Jonathan Edwards. That's the one that he edited. And so I have like his book, which includes the letters, by the way, that he edited. So that's pretty cool. So she eventually became his wife. That's why that one's in there. But there's some others that are just absolutely. I mean, so someone, writes, I'm absolutely converted. I've accepted Jesus into my heart. Now what? Right? Because a couple days later, you're like, okay. That was at church on Sunday, and I decided, yes, I'll accept Jesus into my heart. But now here it is a couple days later, and you're like, so what does that do? How do I now that I've been saved, how do I behave? So that's pretty interesting. So here's the first Great Awakening, etc. So he was involved in that. First and greatest homegrown American philosopher, I don't know who would argue that. So that's interesting too. Kind of on a sad note though, he was still relatively young when he became president of Princeton College. And during the first year, one of the things that was invented was the smallpox vaccine. And the doctor with that visited and was trying to give the smallpox vaccine to people, and they were all scared of it. And he, as president of the college, said, "Oh, there's nothing to be afraid of, I'll show you." And he was vaccinated and died.
Oh my God.
That vaccine's still gross.
So that was kind of sad.
That's a pretty terrible way to go.
Yeah.
Pretty noble though, I guess, because at least they wouldn't have given that to all those people. So
I mean, it's better than getting killed by the Catholic Church
And he is buried
or some other.
in the Princeton Cemetery. Yep. He died March 22nd, 1758, following complications from a smallpox inoculation. Gosh, I remembered all that stuff. Just amazing.
but would you remember it in a million years if you were immortal? Do you think?
We should have this conversation then and see what we remember. That would be great. I bet it won't nearly be as interesting, though.
Maybe you'll forget to have the conversation.
I'll put it on my calendar today. if Google goes that far.
I don't know. How far?
Cool. Be interesting. How far does your calendar go? So let's talk about some of Berkeley's philosophy, because he is fascinating. And just like, with Descartes, I feel like, we should be aware that he might have been just fooling people. By the way, thanks for your test ones. They were great. I hope you like my comments, etc. Cool. So Descartes, the facade he has is one thing, but if we read between the lines, what's really going on in his head, I think we can think about that stuff. With Berkeley, his idealism, he's an empiricist. So just like Hobbes, just like Locke, he believes all our knowledge comes from our sense perceptions. He's an empiricist. However, he doesn't believe in matter. So John Locke is a materialist. He believes that all of our knowledge comes from our sense perceptions, but everything that exists is matter, right? And the bad thing about that, as you read the dialogue, which is between Philonous, which means love of mind, and Helos, which is matter. So it's matter versus soul or spirit or whatever. That's the argument. And matter argues, Helos argues that all of our knowledge comes from our senses receiving input from matter. But the trouble is, as Locke discovers and says that we have the inherent qualities of the thing that we can never see, the things in itself, all we're aware of are the secondary qualities that we receive as kind of the way the thing influences our senses, right? So we can never actually see the thing in itself. So what Berkeley, through Helos and Philonous' discussion, points out is that this whole theory is a contradiction. To believe that all of our knowledge comes from the things themselves, but we can never know them. We can never know the thing in itself, and yet that's where all of our knowledge comes from. As a result, you can never have knowledge of anything, right? So that's terrible, right? On the other hand, if we accept that all of our knowledge is knowledge of our perceptions are the same stuff as our mind is. That is their spirit. Remember, I would say energy today, right? This is absolutely the case. All the experiences you're having are electrical energy in some kind of reaction in your brain, right? So in a sense, he's absolutely right. But what he's saying is it's all spirit, right? And the momentum at the time is towards more matter, right? So he loses in the persuasion game. But Leibniz and him are on the same sheet of music, and basically they've leapfrogged over their time period and are closer to the way we view things today by understanding that it's not physical matter, because that is actually a contradiction. Spirit cannot have any means of interacting with matter because there's nothing in common, right? If we're experiencing an influence on our energy, it has to be energy that influences it, right? But if everything is energy, and then of course our senses are reacting to energy, and in fact, that really, eventually we'll see that kind of does away with the problem of feeling like we can't actually know anything, because we're absolutely aware that our energy is being influenced by energy in a certain way. There's not something out there besides the energy that we're experiencing that we can't know about, right? But so the dialogue is an attempt to persuade people not to accept matter as the cause of everything. And Berkeley has a very serious concern about this. And if you accept that theory, you're eventually going to feel like there's no need for God. Because the theory before is that God is what causes, God's spirit is basically what's causing everything. And for him, all this energy is actually the mind of God, which actually strikes me as very Spinozaist, really. Right? Everything is energy, and that energy and all of its things is essentially God in the universe. He's very careful not to say that God is everything, but the mind of God is everything that we experience, right? So that's his way of getting around that. But as a result of people believing in the material world and thinking that everything is caused by that, eventually they won't believe that there's any use for God, and they will eventually become atheists. And you know what? Berkeley is exactly right. It didn't happen right away, because Locke is relatively new and radical. But guess what? If we go and look at Northern Europe today, an awful lot of the Northern Europeans are atheists. I think you're just being ridiculous for getting involved in a vocabulary that suggests there's some kind of eternal, omnipotent being that's responsible for everything. Why do you need that model? That model's not useful for anything. Instead, the model is cause and effect, everything material, etc. To argue that they're basically trapping themselves in a model that doesn't lend to figuring out a lot of things that are obvious, like our abilities to know things. Obviously, I can manipulate matter. Matter influences me, but for me to know what my mom would have thought about something, or to know where I was yesterday, that's not physical matter. That's something else that enables me to do that. And I think thinking in terms of energy, and that our minds are connected to energy through quantum mechanics, is way more powerful. Even though it's very confusing, it's way more powerful. And I think we're going to find more and more. We're already finding all sorts of things that demonstrate that it's a useful theory. And I think he was way ahead of his time, if that's the right interpretation. But of course, if you take the graduate record exam, and he was a wacko that thought everything was spirit. But if you're reading, I think, him and Leibniz together, and they did write to one another. We know that he suggested some changes to Leibniz's calculus that Leibniz incorporated in his calculus, so that was at least one thing. But so when he's talking about energy or spirit, he talks about it. So both he and Leibniz refer to spirit in the mind of God, but I'm radically interpreting that as energy and as quarks. So the monads of Leibniz I think of in terms of quarks. And so basically he's not a wacko, he's way ahead of his time and right in terms of our contemporary perspective. Plus, he gets into this wonderful dilemma here, which sets the stage still further, and that is you have, properly speaking, no idea of your own soul. The issue here is that when you're observing something, you're experiencing it, but you never experience yourself. You are always the subject of your experience, so you can never see yourself. Now, of course, we play the mirror game, I look in the mirror, etc., and I see me. Well, no, I see my reflection in the mirror. Plus it's reversed image, and all that sort of thing. Plus there's a time delay, so I'm not actually seeing myself instantaneously, if there is such a thing. Einstein says there isn't. So that's kind of an interesting dilemma that he sets us up for, and that will accumulate and become very, very interesting when we see David Hume. David Hume will take it and really run with that. It'll become an important thesis. Today, we end up with people like Thomas Metzinger, basically argues you don't really have a self. You're actually a whole bunch of processes that develop processes that specifically refer to yourself as a self. But those processes are in process, and there's no actual self. Instead, it's processes. No such things as selves exist in the world. That's actually pretty brilliant and contemporary. He's out there, you can listen to him.
Structure, it seems to be a representational process that is driven by many different constraints. And it can be controlled experimentally. A self-model is something that can be manipulated. I promised to bring you
Self-model.
3 examples
You have a
for
model
what I
of yourself.
mean by a self-model. Here is the second example. Many of you must have heard of phantom limbs. Some people after amputations at some point still feel the limb that has been amputated.
He doesn't sound it, does he? But he's German. His English is better than mine. But nonetheless, he's from Germany. I've heard his German too, and his German's better than mine too. He's better than me in 2 languages. Okay. Famous line for George Berkeley. This is, along with John Locke gives us tabula rasa. You're supposed to know that. Cocktail parties, make sure you. Oh, John Locke got tabula rasa. Descartes, cogito ergo sum. Hamlet, to be or not to be. Get in there. Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and life is nasty, brutish, and short. War of all against all. You got a couple lines from. But for Berkeley, essay is percipi, and that's weird because the is English is, but essay, to be, in Latin, right? Percipi is translated as to be perceived. And those are both Latin. So to be is to be perceived. Essay is percipi. What's the link to? I don't remember. Okay.
That's quite an article.
It is. G.E. Moore, another British philosopher. So, for him, if it exists, it's only because we perceive it. So this brings up an interesting question, and that's even part of a limerick. What's the difference between a limerick and a poem?
So a limerick has to be funny, and it has a certain rhymes.
Limerick, I thought it wasn't at 5 syllables, 7.
No, that's a haiku. Sorry.
So, there was a young man who said, God must think it exceedingly odd if he finds that this tree continues to be when there's no one about in the quad. Reply, dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I am always about in the quad, and that's why the tree continues to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. Right? So the issue is if things only exist because they're perceived, what about when, like, I'm not looking at something? Is it still there? Well, obviously it is, right? And the so why? The materialist. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Is that like the whole, like if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around here, does it exist?
It's funny you should bring that up. That's our quiz question for today.
Oh,
Is it?
You would feel slighted if you didn't have that question in class, right? That's like one of the philosophical questions. So the quiz question, the tree falls in the forest, and there's no one there to hear it. Does it make a sound?
Yes.
well,
It's a trick question.
It sounds out.
It could-
Yes, it is.
it could trigger a chain of events that you could perceive though, even though you didn't sorry, I should just write this in my answer. I shouldn't be talking about it.
Oh, you can.
But
It's a
I
free
don't know.
country.
It could, like the butterfly effect. It could like carry on into something that you can perceive. So therefore, it would
Yeah.
have to exist. If all the trees fell in the forest, even if we didn't see them, we'd definitely be affected by it. Because we wouldn't have oxygen anymore for every single one.
Mount St. Helena, when it blew, you saw the forest, pictures of the forest afterwards. Everything's just,
Yeah, Bennett. Yeah.
everything's just. Well, his answer is God perceives everything all the time. His concern was if you believe in materialism, that the reason everything persists is because it's a material world. It's the clock motif, right? God made this clock, and it's such a perfect clock, now it's just ticking away, and God doesn't have to interfere with it anymore, right? So we don't need God. That's his worry, right? But if instead the reason that everything persists as it does is because it's all in the mind of God, then you're not going to give up on God because God is your explanation for everything.
Does that prove the existence of God then?
I don't think he tries to prove the existence of God. I don't remember him doing like an ontological argument or anything.
Proves the existence of trees.
I mean, if the idea to be is to be perceived, then God would have to exist because we don't perceive everything. So in a way it does.
Sounds Spinoza-esque too. See, the materialists have faith in substance instead of faith in God. And by the way, all this is similar to Jonathan Edwards. So that was all part of his preaching as well. Yep. Barclay spent 2 years having children with his wife and raising crops, and eventually came to conclude that the king was not going to send the funds to start the university. So he gave up and he came back. But he did leave his books, and he donated half of them to Harvard and the other half to Yale. And one batch burned up in a fire. I think it was the Harvard batch, but the other batch is still at Yale in a special case.
That's cool.
The
So he
original founding library.
Did he not found the
He did
college
not.
Berkeley?
He did not.
Was it just named after him?
Oh, Berkeley in California is named in his honor.
That's cool.
That is cool. Although it is confusing, and I had to look it up because part of the university is the Lawrence Berkeley Labs. But, believe it or not, those are not the same Berkeley that the university is named after. So, the way I understand it, they, on their college thing, say that the school is named in honor of George Bishop George Barclay, who wanted to found the first.
Wait, he was a bishop?
Well, he wasn't at the time, but when he goes back, he becomes a bishop, and becomes a bishop in Ireland, where he tries to take care of his people there, writes other books and stuff, and eventually, of course, dies. So.
Can you be married as a bishop?
He's Episcopalian.
Oh,
Anglican,
okay.
Anglican,
I guess
Church of England.
Yeah.
So so yes.
Okay.
Yeah. What else? How am I doing? What time is it? We still have 5 minutes. So, what did I not did I cover everything? So I think that's pretty good. Let's look on next then. So, is Hume who we do next? Okay. So Hume is kind of like the peak or the end of this British empiricist development in England. I mean, the philosophy, in a sense, moves on. It becomes utilitarianism, I suppose. But Hume is going to be the one that ends up, David Hume is going to be the one that takes the argument to its radical conclusion and leaves you with the sense that there's nothing that we could really know except what we're perceiving at the moment. And that's pretty radical. But he's also very practical. The Scots really liked him. He's one of their most famous philosophers. And if you ever get the chance and you're in Edinburgh, you can go and visit his tomb, which is in the old Calton burial ground in Edinburgh. And they have a picture of the tomb. That's like at the very corner. So you have to like walk all the way up the hill to the castle and then walk all the way down in the cemetery to this particular corner. By the way, there's a statue right here. This is Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln. That's a memorial to all the Americans that died in World War II, or World War I and World War II. I forget.
Why did they put a statue of Lincoln?
Oh, yeah.
He wasn't around.
Well, this is kind of like a cemetery of monuments to things that the Scots highly respect, etc.
I mean, Abraham Lincoln was a great guy.
And he was a Scot,
Was he?
I believe so. Yeah, a lot of the. Now I have to check. Right? Northern Irish, they're saying.
You have to be born in the U.S. to be president. Or
Oh yeah, I'm not saying he was from Scotland.
oh, okay.
I'm just thinking, his language was supposed to be very Saxon, which, if you think, the English language is very incoherent compared to a lot of other languages like French, German, because it's a mix, hodgepodge, a mishmash, folio. Those are all different languages, but you get the idea. But Lincoln, everyone thinks, wow, his speech was terrific. It really impressed folks. Trying to analyze why. And one of the reasons that argued is that his main influences were Shakespeare's plays, not all of them, but the ones that he had access to, and the Bible, the King James Bible. And both of those books are heavily Saxon in the vocabulary, which is coherent, right? So in other words, the area of where his ancestors were from all spoke that language that basically is a very beautiful version of English. It wasn't kind of polluted by other elements, so a lot of the way it delivers, etc., is beautiful because of that coherence, and so it's kind of interesting too. Lincoln's pretty cool. We have some really great courses. We used to. I don't know if they're still offered. I know the one course that everyone on campus that took it really loved was one that was jointly taught by Professor Muller from the Political Science Department and Professor Haycox from the History Department. And they're both two politically opposites, but they're good friends. So it was one of those classes where each of them argued a different perspective on the various aspects of Lincoln's history. So it was a great, although Forrest Neighbors, Dr. Forrest Neighbors is absolutely excellent on Lincoln if you ever get a chance.
We haven't made it to Lincoln.
So you're professor, you're in his class?
Introduction to him.
He's, I've heard him deliver some speeches and they're just, it's like, and we didn't even have to pay for it. It's like free. Okay, so have a good weekend.
Thank you.
And be safe. And we should have more sunlight by the time we get back next week. The sun is coming back. Look at all of that sun.
I know, it was so foggy down here just an hour ago, and now it's beautiful.
That's enough sunlight to power a Tesla convertible. Unfortunately, it's out in space.
Play some David Bowie. Did you hear that part of it?
No.
They were playing David Bowie. I forgot the name of the song.
The man who fell from to Earth. That movie. It was really dumb. It's a really dumb movie.
Wait, why do you think it was dumb? I haven't seen it yet, but I've seen it.
The man who fell to Earth.
Yeah.
It's like he's an alien.
Uh-huh.
He lands, and he lands in a lake.
Yeah.
And and then basically infiltrates. He wants to build a rocket ship so that he can get back home.
Mm-hmm.
But because he's here by accident. But so he has to kind of develop the companies that can build the equipment. So the theory, the plot is that he's the genius that's starting us into the rocket age.
Oh, that's kind of interesting. Why did it suck
But it's
so
because
bad?
he's trying to get to the point where he'll be able to take a rocket home.
Yeah. Was this
But by the time they get to that point, the FBI's figured out that he's an alien and they stop him.
Oh. Was it bad, like, just because you didn't like the plot?
It was really weird.
Oh.
No, that was The Man Who Fell to Earth, wasn't it?
Yeah,
that was like a long time ago. So the full movie is up there?
Well, every full movie is out on the internet if you're willing to look for it.
Well, yeah, I mean, like...
Couchtuner.ag.
Footlocker, Megashare, all those good sites.
It will
Yeah.
Stay away
ruin
from
your
Stay
computer.
away from Pirate Bay. That's not advisable.